Welcome to the Unscript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at onscriptpodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/onscript.
Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Matt Lynch. If you've ever been to the land of Israel and you've toured around the land with someone who knows it intimately, someone who lives and breathes the material, cultural, and ancient world of the Bible, you know that that's an experience from which you can never really go back. You can't think about the Bible the same way anymore. And today's guest is someone who spent a good deal of time in the land of Israel, knows the material, cultural world of the Old Testament, and thinks really hard about the relationship between Bible and archaeology. And for some of us who work primarily with texts, it can be really helpful to attend to the findings of archaeologists. And I think it's really exciting to do that. So that's what we're going to do today. And I hope you get a feel for some of the value of hearing from archaeologists who think about the Bible in this episode. But before we move on, two things real quick. First of all, could I ask you to give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast? That would be very helpful. And second, I did a quick search on Google with the phrase best ways to communicate news, and I came up with a site entitled 10 Simple Secrets to Totally Rock Your Internal Communications. And I thought, oh my word, where have you been all my life? But then I thought about the title, it's secret. I don't know how it came up on my search, because if it's secret anyhow, somehow I got into this site that had all these brilliant insights. I'm not going to read all 10 because I don't know how much I'm supposed to share. It's secret. But the first one was integrate video into your internal communication strategy. How cool is that? So here's my second request then. Could I ask all of you who work somewhere and have access to email that you can email all your colleagues, could I ask you to integrate on-script promoting video into your internal communication strategy? And you might be thinking, what on earth does that mean? To which I say, if you're asking the question, it probably means you're already there. Okay, think about that one while you listen to this episode. Thanks for listening and enjoy. Hi everyone, welcome to OnScript. I am here today with Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott. She is Associate Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Archaeology at William Jessup University. Cynthia did her Ph.D. at the University of Sheffield in the UK. She's an experienced field archaeologist in Israel and is currently part of an archaeological excavation team at Tell Halif in Israel. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that. She's the editor of the 5 Minute Archaeologist in the Southern Levant, which is a user-friendly exploration of basic concepts within archaeology and the techniques and methods used by archaeologists in the field. She's also written Food in Ancient Judah, Domestic Cooking in the Time of the Hebrew Bible. So Cynthia, thanks for joining OnScript.
Thanks for having me. So
have you always had an interest in the study of the past, history, archaeology?
Yeah, I have. I've always loved history. In fact, I was never really any good at school as a kid, but I loved history and I loved reading my Bible. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, and so I loved reading my Bible, but I was always fascinated more by the Old Testament and always...
Let's hear it for the Old Testament.
Right, I just loved it. And when I went to college and I started taking classes on it, and I went to Israel for the first time and in college and did a dig for a day, archaeology never even really entered my mind as far as something that I'd be interested in until that trip. I was 19, because there was something about the archaeology that was history that you could see, that you could touch. A very physical way of holding history in your hands, and that really resonated with me.
And so, what college were you at then?
I was at Simpson College, now Simpson University.
Did you do
Reading.
A semester abroad, or was it a trip abroad, or what was the?
It was a historical geography class with one of my professors for the summer. We did. Israel and Egypt, and we went to all the historical, religious, and archaeological sites, and we had the dig for a day, and we were at the caves of Moresha, which we found nothing except maybe some animal bones, but which is weird. Why I wonder what about that? Even though we found nothing, resonated with me, but something did.
Yeah,
so.
it was there was an electric buzz in the air that like we might find something.
Right.
That's part of it, right?
Yeah,
the allure of
maybe.
that. Yeah, it's funny. I did a one-day dig that prompted my interest. The Temple Mount sifting project.
Right.
So when I was in Israel in 2011, that was the first time I'd done any digging of any kind, and it was really sifting the stuff from the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
But that was really fun.
Yeah. Sifting can be really tedious in some ways, but then when you are finding things and you think, oh, you wouldn't have found that if you hadn't sifted that.
Right.
More than likely.
Yeah. I mean, we were finding bits of, columns from the Temple Mount because they were slightly rounded and you knew they were part of a column of some kind, and animal teeth. And it's pretty cool to find a sheep tooth up there and know that this is a sheep tooth from the Temple Mount. It was exciting and very formative. In fact, my son was 1 at the time, and he was sifting with us, so he started quite early.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, he
that's
tried
cool.
to sift.
He tried.
Yeah. So you've always had this kind of Bible and archaeology interest.
Yeah, in college, the archaeology part came into it. And I just kept pursuing it. It never entered my mind to continue the academic route. I just was like, wow, I really like this and I want to keep studying it. And I guess if I want to keep studying it, I should keep, working on degrees and what do I want to do with it? And I thought, oh, well, I'll teach, and didn't realize that that's more difficult than getting into that point is much more difficult. But I thought, okay, if I want to do this, then I'll just keep going that direction.
And where are some of the places that you've dug?
Yeah, I've dug at quite a few places now. So I started out when I was working on my master's. I was working at Tell Halif, which was directed by Ami Mazar of Hebrew University. Yeah, so really fantastic dig. And really kind of at the time, at the center of that whole high-low chronology debate between Ami and Israel Finkelstein.
Okay, could you give a 1-minute explanation of that? Because most people won't know that.
Yeah. So that's going to be hard to do.
People debate stuff.
They debate stuff endlessly. But the idea being, and it was kind of also at this heart of the so-called minimalist and maximalist debate. What really, what is the Hebrew Bible historically reliable? And that brought up these questions about, okay, is the dating that we've given to certain strata, is that right or wrong? And is it earlier or later, or is it just right? Because it was really dependent upon the biblical text. And so this was at a time when a lot of archaeologists were saying, no, just don't even bother with the biblical text, because it was almost a reaction against people digging with the Bible in one hand and the trowel in the other and making the archaeological data fit the biblical narrative. But then you get into the whole biblical studies, historical critical methods, and looking at the historical reliability of the text. And so that brought archaeologists wondering, okay, we really have this, are these dates right? And so Israel Finkelstein would argue that no, they're not right.
They're off by 80 years or something?
Yeah, they're off, which kind of then is like a snowball effect. Okay, well, what does that mean for what the reigns of David and Solomon actually looked like? And of course, some scholars would then say, well, were there really reigns of these people? And where's the extra historical anchors for those things outside of the biblical text? So it really just kind of reached out into so many different areas. And Rehoboth was being excavated, and if I recall correctly, it wasn't excavated before Ami started digging there. And really clear, 9th century stratigraphy, and 9th century layers, and which kind of ended up being in the heart of this historical reliability chronology debate.
Got it. Yeah.
That's probably not a very good explanation.
No, that's good. And so has that been resolved, or what?
Oh, no. But they've just kind of...
It's just a détente?
Well, I think what was great about Ami is that Ami could see, the good, valuable parts of all the different arguments, and he even modified his chronology a bit based on it. And so I think there's been kind of like a truce, but nothing, of course, has been decided.
Because
there'd be not much to argue about if
stuff
they
you
took
dig
that
up
away.
doesn't have dates on it, and then getting some sort of absolute anchor to hang other events on, or other...
Unless you were, depending on what time period you're in, a coin or a scarab or an inscription of some sort. But those absolute dating artifacts, are uncommon.
Yeah. And then, so you went from Tel Rehov. What was your next site?
Right. So when I went to Rehov, we...
where is that, by the way?
So it is in the Jordan Valley. It's not far from Beit Shan.
Okay. So like south of the Sea Galley.
Right, south of the Sea Galley, about half an hour.
Miles,
So, at most,
miles? Okay.
a half hour drive. Right in the heart of that whole Beit Shan agricultural area. So when I went to Rehov, we started digging every other year after that. And so Ami's cousin, Eilat Mazar, was going to be digging a site called Akziv, and it was just going to be a one summer thing because she had excavated that at Akziv when she was earlier, and they on the very last day, as is like the Murphy's Law of archaeology, you always find the best things on the last day. And they found this small tomb that hadn't been looted.
Huh.
And so in order to stop it from being, they couldn't do anything with it in the last day or so that they had.
So they had to keep it quiet.
And they covered it back up, and they swore they'd come back the next year. 8 years later, they came back. I think it was 8 years. And she asked Ami if she could borrow some of his people, and I was one of those people, so I got to go.
So you were there when they opened the tomb again, and then everything's sitting in there?
I was the registrar for the tomb, and
wow. Which means you're marking down everything that's found.
Yeah, everything. So I was in charge of all the stuff coming out, and we ended up having...
Is that Iron Age tomb, or what?
Yeah, Iron Age Phoenician tomb. That hadn't been looted. A small tomb. You could fit about 3 people in there, and just...
Comfortably?
No. Very uncomfortably. We had to take our shoes off, which you never dig without shoes. So this wasn't like a regular dig where you're using big tools. This was what we call a dental tool dig, where you get the dental tools out and the soft, fine brushes. And we were right on the Mediterranean. It was beautiful. It was also the summer after 9/11, so there were hardly any excavations going on. But it really spoiled you for doing any kind of tell archaeology. But so from there, that was just the one summer. Went back to Rehov, was there for a while. And then when I moved to England for my Ph.D., my supervisor took students to Tell Safi, which is biblical Gath, and asked me to take over teaching that class for her. So I started taking the Sheffield students over to Gath, and that's directed by Aaron Mayer of Bar Ilan University, another fantastic dig. And then...
So you've worked with some really... great people then.
Yeah, and then after my dissertation came out, one of the sites I looked at was Tell Halif, which is now run by Oded Borowski of Emory University, and they were going to restart the excavations, and he asked me if I'd like to be part of that team, and so did that. But then this last summer I was at Abel Beit Ma'aka up north, with Nava Panitz Cohen and Bob Mullins and Naama Yoham Mak, and it was great.
Wow. And so...
who I dug with at Rehov. They were on my Rehov team, so it was like I was digging with really old friends.
Great.
It was
and does
great.
it still have the same thrill to it, or does it feel like work when you go over there? I mean,
No,
it is
does.
work, obviously, but it's still
It's work.
exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like getting up at 4 a.m, but who does? It is, but at the same time, you don't know what you're going to find. There's no, and I tell my students that because I take students and teach them how to dig and how archaeology helps us understand, hopefully, ancient Israel and hopefully the biblical text better. And just like you don't know what's under there. And that's exactly what happened this summer. One of my areas was a dirt swimming pool. It was nothing. Maybe some broken pieces of pottery, but no features, no significant, artifacts, anything. And then my area right next to it had a beautiful, like a granary and 3 remains of 3 ovens and just wonderful.
Which is right up your alley.
It is, I know.
So you're really interested in ordinary life in ancient Israel.
Yeah, daily life, yeah.
Daily life in ancient Israel. So for a lot of people, or I guess there's always this tension with archaeological funding and things like that, where having a big find gives you a nice media splash, and
it does,
and that
which
kind of
gives
attention.
you more money to do more digging.
But that's not really what archaeologists are interested in, right?
Well, I think
you want the big stuff too, but
yeah, I mean, if you ran across, I don't know, name
an archive,
archive or any spectacular,
sure.
Artifact, people always ask, the Ark of the Covenant. Like, well, no, we don't have that. But, you wouldn't say no to that, but I guess it depends on what your research agenda is. And on any dig, there's all sorts of things that are being uncovered and bringing up new questions and hopefully adding to the answers of some other questions. So even at a site that's a city that's got formal fortifications, like a city wall around it, you may be trying to find the city gate, or maybe as where I was in Abel, I was in the area A that has the big cultic complex. But at that cultic complex, my area had this agricultural, stuff, features, which is really quite interesting. So yeah, you take what you can get, but at the same time, you hope it will help with your own research too. So
when you're looking at daily life in ancient Israel, what are some of the things that you're interested in? What gets you excited when you're...
I particularly like digging houses. So at Halif, one of the things that drew me to it is that we were doing household archaeology, where we were uncovering a row of 8th century pillared houses.
So which king was that time of?
So 8th century would be Hezekiah. So Halif was one of the 46 towns destroyed by King Sennacherib of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 701. So that's roughly the time of King Hezekiah of Judah and Isaiah the prophet. And so we're uncovering these rows of houses, and not just the house, but the artifacts, and doing what we call a spatial analysis, which is trying to understand. Because a lot of times on digs you say, I found 8 cooking pots and maybe 3 storage jars. So they're really published and categorized by type. Whereas in a spatial analysis, you're really concerned about the location of the find spot of the artifacts, and not just their find spot, but their find spot in relation to the building, to the features of the building, and to other artifacts.
Other houses too, right?
Yeah, and other houses too. So if you're in a house where you say, I found in this one space, there's an oven, and there's a cooking pot next to the oven, and there's some carbonized grains, and they're all right next to each other. You can say, all right, well, clearly this area was used, the activity conducted in this area was food preparation. But then you could say, but also, not only was that stuff there, but not far from that, against a wall, and this happened at my house at Halif, there's a nice row of loom weights where the loom would have once been, where they were weaving, and was right next to the food preparation area. So it's not just
Don't spill on the stuff we're weaving.
Right. So it's not just the types and where, but the where and where they're related to each other, and their potential activity areas that could reflect.
Yeah, so that was interesting in a paper of yours I read, which is that the way we think about rooms in a house, we kind of have to put some of that aside when we think about an ancient Israelite house. So what are some of the assumptions that we might bring to a house that we need to get rid of?
I think when we think of our own homes today, we think about, and of course it depends on what kind of home you have, but it's not uncommon for people to have a dining room or a office.
Yeah,
or
more limited use places.
Right, a room that might have a singular function. Maybe you have a man cave, or, I don't know. But so we're used to thinking of space in like singularity terms, whereas I think in most ancient societies, whether it's Israel or not, your domestic space would have been very much more utilitarian, where you would have been using it for a variety of activities, not just, oh, hey, we're only going to do this and this. We have limited space, but no, you can't do this in there because we only use this room for that.
And then are they rolling out mats and sleeping in that room at the end of the day?
Right. Well, we think that the houses had 2 stories. And of course, when we excavate the houses, we only have what remains of the first floor. We don't get the second floor unless it's collapsed onto the first floor. So what we think is that there were 2 floors, and that the bottom floor would have been, because I think when we think of houses, we tend to think of today, again, kind of going into those assumptions, and I'll circle back to that question, is that it's just where we live and sleep, and we go out to work elsewhere. Whereas in most, even traditional societies today, but in ancient traditional societies, your home was your workplace. You didn't really go out to, not many people at least, especially in earlier days, would have gone out to a job. So when we think about your household space and how it was used, it's thought that maybe the first floor functioned as a lot of like where your daily activities would take place. And also it would depend on the season. So if it's Israel is very much like California, where we are today and where I'm from, there was most houses, it seems, had some sort of what a lot of scholars call courtyard, but actually more accurately like a forecourt. So an open workspace in the front of the house, which was often shared with maybe other houses right around you, which would have probably also been people you were related to. And so your bottom level of your house, whether it's inside or outside, would have been used for daily activities. And it's thought that maybe the second floor would have been used for
basketball,
sleeping quarters and stuff, and maybe some other light household chores, but then the flat roof of the house too would have also been used. So everything was used.
Everything's multi-use and quite small too. I mean, they're not very big. On average, aren't big homes.
Right. And if you think about how many people could have lived in those homes, that would have not a lot of privacy and personal space.
So Cynthia, are you ready for a speed round?
I think so.
Okay. So the idea is just I'll give you 5 to 10 seconds to answer just off the cuff, no deep thought about them. Okay. What is who is your favorite archaeologist?
My favorite archaeologist? Oh, that's a really good question, but there's a number of people I would probably offend. I'm going to have to say the dig director of my first excavation would be Ami Mazar. So that was the Tel Halif excavation that I was a master's student on and that I was trained at. And Ami is really well known and well respected in the archaeological community as just a very just nice person and a very good archaeologist, very level-headed, very able to see, all sides of the issues. So I'd have to say he's my favorite.
And do you have any other scholarly heroes? So not necessarily only archaeology, but perhaps broader biblical studies or beyond?
Yeah, within biblical studies and archaeology, someone who really had a great impact on my education and just research areas would be Carol Myers. And she's still, her work today is still, fantastic, and actually have the wonderful opportunity to be working with her and another colleague on a project. So that's kind of surreal.
Wow.
That's good. Yeah.
Are you able to say what that project is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Carol and myself and my colleague Jan Ling Fu are co-editing the T&T Clark Handbook of Food in the Hebrew Bible in Ancient Israel.
Oh, fantastic. And I want to come back to Carol Myers to talk about gender and archaeology later. So let's put a pin in that one. The most significant archaeological find for biblical studies in the last 10 years.
The last 10 years. Well, I would say the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that was more than 10 years ago. The most important, that's a really good question. I can't say that there's been one thing that has stuck out as super important. I mean, important on the level of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Tel Dan inscription. I know, that's a really good question. It's lightning round. I'm supposed to be quick about this, and I can't be quick about it. Again, back to Rehov, the apiaries that were found in 2005 and 2007, the couple hundred apiaries that were found from I believe 9th.
So this is, and what's an apiary?
Apiary is a beehive.
Okay, and why is that so significant?
Because up until then, there was no archaeological evidence of at least industrial-sized beekeeping. And so when people read about Israel being a land of milk and honey, a lot of scholars, because of this lack of evidence of beekeeping, thought that the honey that's mentioned in that idiom was actually more of a syrup made from pressed fruit, like dates and figs. And so it was during that excavation, though, that the apiaries were found, and thus proving, yes, there was in beekeeping in ancient Israel.
Okay, if you could plunge your shovel and trowel into one unexcavated tell, which would it be?
I don't know. I can't think. I mean, so many sites have been excavated.
Are there a lot that people look at and are like, we'd love to get funding to excavate there, but we just can't?
Yeah, and there's not a lot to my knowledge, and I'm not very knowledgeable on that as far as, what tells small, especially ones that haven't been excavated. But the Tel Abel Beit Ma'akah excavation way up north in northern Israel, that hadn't been excavated until I think there was a survey, but it hadn't been, part of an excavation project until somewhat recently, like 8 years ago. The excavations started there under Nava Panitz Cohen and Nama Mak from Hebrew University and Bob Mullins from Azusa Pacific University.
Okay. And you're digging there, right?
I did, yeah.
You did dig there.
I was there this last summer, and hopefully I'll be there again this summer.
And then where are you originally from?
For me, I'm from Southern California originally, and then I moved up to Northern California when I was in high school, so I'm just a California gal. So
in what town in Northern California?
I'm in Auburn.
Okay, so do you have a favorite hometown restaurant?
I do. It's called Joe Caribe's.
Okay, and what do they serve there that we all need to go eat?
It's a wonderful place. It's this really interesting fusion of Indian, Caribbean, Tex-Mex, Asian. It's just this real eclectic place. And my favorite thing to get there is their chicken curry burrito.
Okay. I've never heard all
really
those things brought together, so
I know,
it sounds very interesting.
It is really interesting.
When my wife and I were on, we did a month-long road trip, and we stopped in Northern California in a little town, and our approach was to go to churches or anyone we saw and ask if we could put our tent up in the kind of churchyard or something. And I remember we stopped at a place that was called Willow Creek, and it was like this little church, probably of about 50 people or less. And we had we harvested mussels from the ocean and thought it was going to be really cool to cook our own mussels, and they tasted awful. Anyway, that's when you talked about food in Northern California, I've got a bad taste in my mouth, so I need to go back and it's my own doing, but need to try that. Okay, would you choose beer, wine, mead, port, or sherry?
Wine.
Okay.
Yeah,
White
that
or
was a
red?
quick one. Red.
Okay. So when people hear that you study food in the Bible, do they A, try to send you Ezekiel bread recipes, B, try to convince you of the nutritional benefits of the Daniel diet, C, try to convince you that the alcohol per unit in wine was vastly different than it is today when in the Bible, D, all of the above, or E, other?
D, all of the above.
Okay, you've gotten all those.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, and do you subscribe to the nutritional benefits of the Daniel diet?
Well, I mean, vegetarian diet is usually a pretty good diet.
No, but I mean like the kind where they're like, we got to really be biblical about it. I don't know how you would do that.
Yeah, but I don't know. When people try to commercialize biblical stuff, it never goes well. So, the whole Daniel diet or the Jesus diet or, it's just, that stuff really puts me off.
Yeah, but you're never going to get wealthy with that mindset.
I know.
I think you need to.
I know.
I think you need a wealth mindset. And maybe this is going to be the spur to get you out of your current mindset
maybe.
toward a wealth mindset.
Yeah, maybe I should do what would the ancient Israelites cookbook?
Yeah, it has to have the word secret in the title. The Secret Israelite Cookbook.
Right. The Secret Israelite Cookbook.
Yep.
There you go.
On sale now. Pre-order. Okay. I mean, you could create a cover and have it on Amazon tonight, and then get pre-orders, and then write the thing based on how many pre-orders you get. Okay. What's one idea in biblical studies that you think needs to die?
One idea in biblical studies that I think needs to die. In proper biblical studies, or like...
Take it where you want.
Okay. Within like actual biblical studies, it needs to die. It kind of already has died, and I'm kind of glad. Hopefully, it is dead, and not necessarily dead, but hopefully it's run its course. Is the so-called minimalist maximalist debate that you saw in the 90s and early 2000s, and it's I understand the conversation. I understand it's an important conversation to have, but the lengths that it went to as far as the name calling and the category and lumping people into different categories was just so childish to me.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Have things kind of landed in the middle, or is it just that's not the debate right now?
Probably a little of both. I don't think it's a huge conversation piece within these fields right now. which I'm glad, because both sides had some really valuable points. And like most things, it's not a either or. It doesn't have to be, extremes on either end or an either or. It could be both and maybe there's, a third or fourth or fifth option.
Okay, what's one? Oh no, I just asked that. What's the any other ideas? Okay, the most significant book in biblical studies or ancient Israelite history, archaeology in the last 50 years.
The most significant. Well, see, you could still really easily offend people. Everyone thinks that their stuff is really significant. Well, let me look at my bookshelf behind me.
She's reaching for her book.
I could be really selfish and say, oh, my own work. But no, that wouldn't be the case. I'd probably, for me personally, and maybe not just in the scholarly community, but yes, in the scholarly community, but probably more for me personally would have been Discovering Eve. And that was in the 80s.
By Carol Myers?
That was in the 80s. Yeah, I have to check the original publication. Or late 90s or something like that.
Okay. It fits within the time frame.
Yeah, just because, I was a master's student and I loved archaeology. I loved biblical studies and I loved gender studies. But I hadn't really investigated too much at that point to see how all three of them could intersect in a way, because I was always really interested in the daily life stuff too. So how could those four things work together as a research field? And so when my advisor at the time, David Baker, suggested I read Discovering Eve, that was very eye-opening for me, because that's exactly what she does. Is she does biblical studies, Hebrew Bible, archaeology, women, daily life, and all of those things mixed up together showed me that yes, you can do all of these things together. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right. All right, we're going to get to that in a moment, but I want to... Do you have Christmas crackers in the States? I say it as if like I'm not American as well, but I've just been living. I've been living in the UK and in Europe for almost 10 years, so I just forget what's around. Those things where they pop.
Yeah. Okay. I did my Ph.D. studies in England, so I know exactly what you mean.
You know them.
But so, you do see them now. Maybe not as. I was in Safeway last weekend and I saw them. Grocery store.
Made their way over.
Yeah, and the World Market, I think, has had them, Cost Plus World Market has had them for quite some time, but you're starting to see them in less specialty type places.
Okay, like so that Safeway, leads me into
so they're here.
So that leads me into a joke that I got out of my recent Christmas cracker that I popped at a work party. So why should you never invite a team of footballers for Christmas? Now, footballers, soccer players.
Right.
For our listeners.
Why?
Because they are always dribbling. Thanks for laughing. All right,
You're
what
welcome.
7-letter word has hundreds of letters in it?
A 7-letter word has hundreds of letters in it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
A letterbox. A post box. Sorry, post box.
Yeah, mailbox.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also 7 letters. And let's transition to talk about gender and archaeology. I know we're running short on time, but I want to just touch on that because you've mentioned Carol Myers' work, and it seems to intersect with your some of the work that you've done on household archaeology. And I don't know, have you seen there's a recent book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez?
I have not.
Okay. In the intro, she wrote something that caught my attention because I knew I was going to be talking to you. And she recounts a story from 1966 at the University of Chicago. There was a symposium on primitive hunter-gatherer societies. And this meeting was called Man the Hunter.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard of it, yeah.
You've heard about this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I've heard about the man, the hunter. But,
okay. So there's 75 anthropologists from around the world, and they're debating the centrality of hunting to human evolution and development. And then the consensus out of this, and she quotes, "The biology, psychology, and customs that separate us from the apes, all these we owe to the hunters of time past." And then that was kind of one of the published results. And then she talks about a 1975 essay by Sally Slocum called "Woman the Gatherer." And then she challenged the primacy of man the hunter. And she said anthropologists, quote, "search for examples of the behavior of males and assume that this is sufficient for explanation." And then she asked a simple question: what were females doing while the males were out hunting? And then she goes on to talk about what women were doing and then how that changes our thinking about evolutionary biology and so on. And I bring that up to just highlight the ways that a male bias factored in anthropology. What are some of the ways that it factors in archaeology?
Yeah, and that's been talked about by a number of female scholars and archaeologists, so I'll just pick up from what they've said and would highlight that too, is that, historically we have focused on, in archaeology and within biblical studies, we focused on monumental places, people, events, or what others have said, like places of prestige, and that could be, the palaces, the temples, the city walls, the battlefields, the priests, the kings, the commanders of the armies, the soldiers, all of those things that are big monumental people, places, and events that very rarely reflect not only what women were doing, but oftentimes just your average person, your average man, woman, or child, not even just the women, because those are places of prestige where your average person is rarely going to be interacting in that context unless like they are a soldier as part of a battle or something. So our very interests historically in these places of prestige and these monumental places has reflected a very male-centered, and not just male-centered, but elite male-centered, elite urban male-centered focus of our scholarship. So what gender archaeology has done, and household archaeology as well, and has shifted that focus from the monumental to the mundane, to the places and the people in the daily activities, the activities that occur on a daily basis by your average men, women, and children, which may not seem as glamorous or as sexy or as fun to study, but if we truly want to understand ancient Israel and ancient Judah better, we need to shift our focus from the monumental to the mundane. And the mundane, the stage of where daily life occurred, would be the home.
And the mundane can be pretty interesting, though. So what are some of the ways that looking at the mundane has begun to reshape how we understand ancient Israel?
Right. So even looking at daily food preparation practices and what that would have looked like. And of course, that means using archaeology, that means using textual material, including biblical texts and other ancient Near Eastern texts, includes iconography, ethnoarchaeology, all of these things at our disposal that we want to try to use to help us understand ancient Israel better. And looking at food preparation practices has really opened our eyes to the role of women and the control and authority and power, especially like a matriarch of a household would have had over your food preparation, deciding what of the harvest is going to be stored, what of the harvest is going to be distributed as far as trade, or maybe what's going to be prepared into what products, what's going to be made into a meal, how much of that's going to be used, who gets to eat, how much do they get to eat, when do they get to eat. I mean, that's a lot of power, whoever is in control of the food. And it seems like from all of these different types of sources, from a variety of different research by different people, it seems like women, in particular, the matriarch of the household, was in charge of that. So when we talk about women not having any power within her world, I think we are looking at it, of course, from our 21st century perspective on what consists of power, as opposed to looking at trying to put ourselves in their cultural context and what that could have looked like for them. Of course, it could be very different than ours, but at the same time, I think there are clues to where we have been ignoring these very valuable people within a household that would have had strong implications to how ancient Israelite and Judite households functioned.
Yeah, and I can imagine that each term that you use in a discussion about food preparation or household needs defining or redefining because of the assumptions that we bring to those things. Because when I think of food preparation, I might think of grocery store to table, but that's missing 90% of the process. And when we talk about household, I might think of a family that's on its own in a house, but that's not what it was. And so all of these places and processes need redefining, and as you do that, and your work is so helpful in that, and people like Carol Myers, it really just changes your perception of the power and role of women and their relationship, their kind of working relationship with men.
Yeah, right. And that, and it's interesting because one of the classes, I'll connect this together, I promise. One of the classes I teach here at Jessup and just finished teaching this semester is a Women in Scripture course. And it's interesting, these conversations that these students want to have is, because it's not only women in Scripture, both, Hebrew Bible, Deuterocanonical, New Testament, but then also at the end of the semester and all through the semester, really talking, because Jessup is a Protestant school, looking at, the so what question, so what does that mean for us today? And what does that mean for, women in the church and leadership in the church and all this stuff? And one of the questions that, discussion topics that kept coming up is, what is women's roles? And people always using the biblical text to say, well, a biblical worldview of gender roles is that the man, is the provider, and he goes and does all the work, and the woman stays home and takes care of the children. And when we take, real research of the biblical world into consideration, you have to say, well, what you are saying is a biblical worldview of let's say, gender roles, is wrong, because your average ancient Israelite man, woman, and child, everyone worked at home. Nobody left to go, it wasn't like a normal thing for people to leave and have a job. Everyone in the household was imperative for the survival of the household, regardless of your age, regardless of your sex, regardless of anything. Every member was imperative, and every member participated in the survival, and generally that participation happened within the dwelling and the surrounding farmland.
Yeah, and also I would imagine too, it's really helpful to think through this. And I would imagine as well, it changes when you think about the technological skills that women had as well, that food preparation it just requires a high level of skill in quite a number of areas. And we're just talking about food, right? and
think about it too. If men go off to war, then daily life doesn't stop. The fields still need to be harvested or planted. You still need to make food. You still need to get water. You still need to make your clothes. Nothing gets put on pause. And so it was left to the people who were left in the household, which would have been primarily the children, maybe the so-called elderly, and the women of the household. So if there was a war and the able-bodied men of the household were gone, then everything was put on her shoulders.
Yeah, and you think about how even in the modern context, war reshaped gender, the way that women were involved in the workforce, at least in the States and in Britain. And if war was not that uncommon, then women are always going to have to know how to cover for the men in their families. Yeah, that's fascinating. So your course on women and gender, did you have like a main textbook for that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's the second time I've taught it. So I'm still looking for a really good New Testament book, but I've used Bellis's Helpmates, Harlots, and Heroes for women in the Hebrew Bible. And then, of course, Carol Newsom's commentary on women in Scripture. And then the New Testament one this year, I used Lynn Cohick's book, but that was ended up being more on like the New Testament world, which is, very fascinating. But I am looking for something that's kind of like the Bellis book, but for New Testament. So if any of your listeners have any ideas.
Well, my colleague and boss, Lucy Peppiatt, just wrote a book on women in Scripture with IVP. And that's a really good one. That just came out this autumn. Yeah. So what are some of the ways that your study of material culture impacts your faith?
Yeah. For me, as somebody who loves history and being able to excavate that history, it's history that I can see and I can touch, and that these for me it's the story behind the artifacts. Right? I love the artifacts. I love the material culture. I love the architecture, the features. I love it all. But what gets me is whenever I think about the stories behind them. And I think about, okay, yeah, you've got these biblical narratives, and of course you have that discussion with people on using archaeology in the Bible and all that stuff. But regardless of how you feel about that, when you're excavating it, you can't help but think about, oh yeah, I remember this narrative from the Hebrew Bible or this narrative from the New Testament, and having archaeology help us understand the biblical world better, which then of course is going to help us understand the Bible better. And if you come from a faith background, or if you're on a faith journey, of course that can't help but to impact your own faith. And of course it's going to be different for different people. But for me, being part of that is truly a privilege and an honor. And I think about, okay, if I'm helping understand the biblical world better, maybe this is going to help somebody else understand the Bible and its world better. And using everything at our disposal can only help us understand the biblical text better, which if we allow the text to speak for itself, allow archaeology to speak for itself, and see if they help each other at all, then that's fantastic. And then what do I do with that, with the so what question? You always have to ask that so what question. Well, at least for those of us that like those kind of questions. But, that so what question, what does that do for me and my faith? And, I'm at a place where the more I learn, the more I am okay with knowing that I don't know everything. And sometimes there's not answers for everything. And I have become more comfortable being in that place of wonderment and being in that place of just kind of awe and being okay with not having all the answers. And whether that's with archaeology or biblical studies or my own faith journey, I feel like I'm finally at a place where I'm like, okay, yeah, I have these questions and I may not find the answers right now, or maybe what I think is a good answer might change. I don't know, but I'm okay with that. And so there's something about finding the tangible that is making the untangible really okay.
That's a great place to bring this to a conclusion. So, Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us at OnScript.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.